It's time we were going, Liza, Mrs. Drozdoff said with distaste. She rose, ready to leave. She now seemed to regret calling herself a fool in her recent fright. As she listened to Dasha, a haughty twist had appeared on her lips. But what had struck me most since Dasha's arrival was Liza's face. Her eyes now sparkled with unrestrained scorn and hatred. "Wait a few more minutes, Praskovia, please," Mrs. Stavrogin said, stopping her with the same unnatural calm. "Do me a favor and sit down, for I would like to finish saying what I have to say, and I know your legs ache. A while ago I lost my temper and said some unwarranted things to you, so please forgive me. I did a stupid thing, and am the first to admit it now, for I believe in being fair. Of course, when you lost your temper, you mentioned some anonymous letters, but any anonymous message should be treated with contempt, if only because it is unsigned. If you look at the matter differently, I don't envy you. In any case, I wouldn't have brought it up in your place. I wouldn't want to dirty my hands with it. However, you have dirtied yours. And since you have brought up the subject, let me tell you that 6 days ago I also received a clownish, anonymous letter. Some low character wrote that Nikolai has gone mad and that I must beware of some lame woman who, as the letter puts it, I remember it well, will play a fatal part in my life. Knowing that my son has many enemies around here, I sent for a man whom I knew to be a secret enemy of his, perhaps the most spiteful and despicable of them all. And after a talk with him, I was sure of the origin of those loathsome anonymous letters. Now, my poor Praskovia, if you have also been bothered through my fault by such despicable notes, if you have been peppered with them, as you say, I am, of course, terribly sorry to have been the innocent cause of it. That's what I wish to explain to you. And now I'm sorry to see that you're so tired out. Anyway, I have decided to let in that man whom Maurice says cannot be received, a word that doesn't really apply in this case. And I think that for Liza especially, this will not be the proper place to be. Come here, Liza. Let me kiss you once more. Liza crossed the room and stood silently in front of Mrs. Stavrogin, who took her by the hands, kissed her, held her at a little distance from her, looked at her, made the sign of the cross over her, then pulled her back to her and kissed her again. "Well, goodbye, Liza," Mrs. Stavrogin said. She sounded on the verge of tears. "And believe me, I'll always love you, whatever happens. God bless you. I have almost submitted gladly to his divine will." She was on the point of saying something more, but she contained herself. Liza walked back toward the chair in which she had been sitting, still silent and deep in thought. Suddenly she stopped before her mother. "I'm not going home yet, Mother. I'll stay a while longer with Aunt Varvara," she said quietly, but with determination. "Good gracious, what is this?" Praskovia wailed, helplessly wringing her hands. But Liza didn't answer. She didn't seem to hear her. She simply resumed her seat and sat there staring somewhere into space again. A proud, triumphant expression appeared on Mrs. Stavrogin's face. "Maurice, I must ask you to do me a favor. Go downstairs and have a look at that man, and if it's at all possible to let him in, bring him here." Maurice bowed and went out. A minute later he returned with Lebyadkin. I have mentioned what Lebyadkin looked like, a tall, heavy, curly-haired fellow of about 40 with a ruddy, bloated face, cheeks that quivered with every movement of his head, small, beady, bloodshot eyes that sometimes had a sly look in them, side whiskers and mustache, and a rather too prominent, unpleasant-looking Adam's apple. But oddly enough, that day he was wearing a frock coat and a clean shirt. It reminded me of one of Laputin's quips. There are people on whom a clean shirt looks positively indecent. The captain wore black gloves. That is, he held the right glove in his fleshy left hand, which was halfway encased in the unbuttoned left glove. In the same hand, he also held a glossy top hat that I'm sure he was wearing for the first time. So the lover's frock coat about which he had shouted outside Shatov's door really did exist. Later, I found out that both the frock coat and the shirt had been previously acquired on Laputin's advice. And there was little doubt that he had also driven up in a horse cab upon someone else's prompting and with someone else's help, for it would never have occurred to him to come here. Then, too, he had to dress and get ready in some 45 minutes, even assuming that he had found out about the scene at the cathedral at once. He wasn't drunk now, but he was in a state of hazy stupor, typical of a man who has come to after days of heavy drinking. He looked as though, if someone had taken him by the shoulders and given him a couple of good shakes, he'd have become drunk again. He entered the room quickly and tripped over the rug, which made Maria roll with laughter. He threw her a fierce look, turned briskly toward Mrs. Stavrogin, and took a few quick steps toward her. "I have come here, ma'am," he blared as if talking into a megaphone. "Please, my dear sir," Mrs. Stavrogin said, sitting up very erect. "Sit down over there. That chair there, you see. I'm sure I will be able to hear you from there, and at the same time I will be able to see you much better." The captain stopped and stared blankly in front of him. Then he obediently sat down on the chair by the door to which Mrs. Stavrogin had pointed. His face expressed a mixture of hesitation, arrogance, and chronic resentment. It was obvious that he was frightened, and that it was precisely his fear that offended his pride and made him resentful and capable of insolence. He was painfully aware of every movement of his big body, and as is usually the case under such circumstances, his main problem was his hands. He felt at every moment the futility of trying to find an appropriate place for them. At last he froze in his chair, clutching his hat and gloves, and fixed his blank stare on Mrs. Stavrogin's stern face. He may have wanted to look around the room, but thus far he hadn't dared. Maria probably found this awkward posture irresistibly funny and burst out laughing again, but he didn't budge. Meanwhile, Mrs. Stavrogin examined him mercilessly for a full minute. "First of all, I would like you to tell me your name yourself," she said in measured, impressive tones. "Captain Lebyedkin," he blared. "I've come, ma'am." He started to rise, but she stopped him with a gesture. "Wait! Is this poor person who has aroused my interest really your sister?" "Yes, ma'am, she's my sister, and she has slipped away from my supervision because she's in a condition..." He faltered and turned purple. "Please don't get me wrong, ma'am." He was becoming inextricably entangled. "A brother won't slander his sister. When I mentioned her condition, I didn't mean in the sense that it stained her reputation. I wanted to say that lately..." He abruptly fell silent. "Please, sir," Mrs. Stavrogin said, throwing back her head. "I mean that sort of condition," he concluded, placing his index finger on his temple. There was a brief pause. "And has she suffered from it for long?" Mrs. Stavrogin asked in a drawling tone. "I've come, ma'am, to thank you for the kindness you displayed toward her at the cathedral, to thank you in a brotherly, Russian way." "Brotherly? Well, only in the sense that I am my sister's brother, ma'am, and I would like to assure you," he went purple again and spoke faster, "that I'm not really as uncouth as I may look to you at first glance in your drawing room. My sister and me were nothing, ma'am, compared to the luxury in which you live and which we see here. But I am a Lebyedkin, ma'am, And I'm proud of my reputation, so I've come to thank you, and here's the money, ma'am. He brought out his wallet, pulled a wad of bills out of it, and started counting them with wild impatience. His fingers trembled. He was obviously very anxious to explain something, and indeed, an explanation was urgently needed. Finally, feeling that counting the bills like that was making him look foolish, he lost all control of his fingers. The bills stuck together. His fingers became all entangled. And to top everything, one green bill escaped and, zigzagging slowly, floated down to the carpet. "20 rubles, ma'am." Lebyadkin leaped to his feet, holding up the bundle of bills, his face streaming with sweat in his agony. Then he caught sight of the bill on the floor, bent to pick it up, but felt that that would be too undignified, and shrugged. "That's for your servants, ma'am. For your footmen. For him to remember Miss Lebyadkin by." "I can't allow that," Mrs. Stavrogin said hurriedly, with audible apprehension. "In that case..." He bent again and picked up the bill, turning purple. Then he crossed the room to Mrs. Stavrogin and held out the money to her. "What is this?" she said, quite frightened now, and jerked back in her chair. Mr. Verkovensky and Maurice took a step in her direction. Don't worry, I'm not mad. I'm all right." Captain Lebyadkin tried eagerly to reassure everybody. "I don't agree, my good sir. I think you're out of your mind." "But, ma'am, I'm not at all what you think. Of course, I'm nothing but an insignificant cog. Oh, madam, you live in palaces and are richly furnished. But the dwelling of my sister, Maria, the Nameless, née Lebyadkin, is poor and miserable. We'll call her Nameless, by the way, only for the time being. For God himself won't allow her to remain that way forever. You gave her 10 rubles, ma'am, and she took them. But she accepted them only because they were from you, ma'am, and I hope you appreciate that. Maria the Nameless would not have accepted money from anyone else, for that would have made her grandfather turn in his grave. He was a fighting officer killed on the field of honor in the Caucasus before the eyes of Yermolov himself. But from you, ma'am, she'd accept anything. However, each time she takes 10 rubles with one hand, she'll hand you 20 with the other as a gift for one of your ladies' philanthropic committees in Moscow. For I know you yourself announced, ma'am, in the Moscow News that you were conducting a local fundraising drive and that anyone might contribute." He suddenly ran out of breath. He had been breathing very hard as though performing some difficult athletic feat. What he had said about the philanthropic committee must have been prepared, probably also with Laputin's coaching. He was perspiring heavily, and huge drops of sweat were visible on his temples. Mrs. Stavrogin glared at him piercingly. The subscription list is always available downstairs, and it's with the hall porter, and you can enter your subscription there if you wish to, she said sternly. So I would appreciate it very much if for the time being you would stop waving your money around and put it in your pocket. That's better. Now, I'm very sorry, sir, that I made such a mistake about your sister and offered her charity as though she were a pauper when she's really so rich. However, there's still one thing that remains quite unclear to me. Why should she accept charity from me alone and never from anyone else? You insisted so on that point that I would like you to explain it to me precisely. That, ma'am, is a secret that will go to the grave. But why? Mrs. Stavrogin insisted, a little less firmly now. Oh, madam. He became grimly silent, placing his right hand on his heart. Mrs. Stavrogin waited, her eyes fixed on him. Madam, he roared suddenly. Please, madam, allow me to ask you one question, one single question, but let me ask it frankly, in the open Russian way. By all means. Have you suffered in your life, ma'am? Are you trying to tell me that you have suffered or are suffering through someone else's fault? Here, ma'am, here, he shouted, jumping up, probably without realizing it himself and pounding his chest. Here in my heart there is accumulated so much bitterness that God himself will be amazed when it all comes out on Judgment Day. Rather strongly put. Madam, if my language is full of resentment. Please don't worry about that. I'll stop you if need be. May I ask another question, ma'am? Go ahead, ask me another question. Can one die of excessive nobility of the soul alone? I wouldn't know. I've never studied the matter. What? You say you never have? He shouted with theatrical irony. Well then, since it's like that, be still, O heart, bereft of hope. And he again pounded his chest extravagantly. He started to pace the room. A common characteristic of people of this sort is their complete inability to keep their desires to themselves. On the contrary, they feel an irresistible urge to display them in all their messiness as soon as they spring up in them. In polite society, such a person will always start timidly, but if you yield him a hair's width, he is sure to leap to the utmost insolence. Now Lebyakin was excited. He walked up and down the room, waving his arms, paying no attention to the questions he was asked, chattering something about himself so fast, and now and then he seemed to trip over his own tongue, and would abandon an unfinished sentence and skip to another one. True, he was probably not completely sober, for despite his much publicized infatuation for Liza, he hadn't once looked at her, although she was sitting right there. But then, this is only an assumption on my part. Anyway, whether he was drunk or not, Mrs. Stavrogin must have had a good reason for containing her repugnance for such a character and listening to him. As to Mrs. Drozdoff, she trembled in horror, although I don't believe she understood what was behind it all. Mr. Verkovensky was trembling too, but for the opposite reason. As usual, he was inclined to read more into the situation than was actually there. Maurice stood in the attitude of one who was ready to rush to protect anyone who might require protection. Liza, who was very pale, stared at the wild man with wide-open eyes. Shatov sat unbudging in his original position. But the strangest change had come over Maria. She had not only stopped laughing, but now looked infinitely sad. She leaned her right arm on the table and followed her orating brother with a long, sad gaze. Dasha alone looked calm and composed.